The sky over the Eastern Front was a battlefield unlike any other. It stretched vast and endless, a canvas of grey clouds and harsh sunlight, where the roar of engines mixed with the distant thunder of artillery. Soviet pilots had grown accustomed to these skies, skilled, disciplined, always alert, but even the most experienced among them carried a deep respect, even of fear, for the machines that streaked above them. Among these machines, one stood out, one that both terrified and fascinated them: the Focke-Wulf Flaw 190. The Fu-190 was unlike anything the Soviet Air Force had faced before. When it first appeared over the front lines in 1941, it was a revelation. Its design was sleek, powerful, aggressive, a fighter built to dominate the skies. Pilots who saw it for the first time described it as a bullet with wings, a shape that seemed to cut through the air effortlessly. The engine roared like a living beast, propelling it at speeds that few Soviet aircraft could match, and in the hands of a skilled German pilot, it was nearly unstoppable. But the awe it inspired was mixed with fear. Soviet pilots knew the stories. They had heard rumors from those who had faced it in combat. The Fu-190 could dive faster than any Soviet fighter. It could turn with surprising agility, and its armament could rip through planes like paper. Reports described German pilots spinning the aircraft into impossible maneuvers, evading entire squadrons as if gravity were merely a suggestion. The Fu-190 had become the symbol of German air supremacy, a predator in the skies. Yet, for all its power, the Fu-190 was not invincible. The Soviet Air Force had spent years learning its strengths and, more importantly, its weaknesses. Engineers and tacticians studied captured wrecks, examining twisted metal and scorched engines. Pilots shared stories of close encounters, noting the patterns, the tendencies, the subtle flaws that could be exploited. But there remained one aspect that was rarely spoken aloud, a trait that seemed almost paradoxical. Its very strength, the feature that made it so deadly, also hid a vulnerability that could turn the tide of an encounter in the blink of an eye. It was late afternoon when a group of Soviet pilots first witnessed it. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows across the frozen plains. They were flying in formation, scanning the horizon for any sign of German fighters, when a flash of motion caught their eyes. An Fw-190 had appeared, diving with precision, slicing through the clouds with terrifying speed. The Soviet pilots tensed, hearts pounding. Every instinct screamed to engage, to react. But there was a moment, a fleeting, almost surreal moment, when time seemed to slow. The Fu-190 executed a maneuver that was both beautiful and horrifying. It spun, tight and controlled, a barrel roll that displayed the pilot's mastery over his machine. But something unexpected happened. The aircraft did not stabilize as it should have. Instead, it wobbled, the elegant arc turning into a chaotic spin. Smoke trailed from the engine, and for a heartbeat, the German fighter seemed vulnerable in a way the Soviets had never seen. It was this moment that changed everything. For decades, the Fu-190 had been an almost mythical adversary, a symbol of German engineering and aerial dominance. But now, in that icy sky over the Eastern Front, Soviet pilots saw the truth. The same design that gave the Fu-190 its incredible power, its exceptional speed, its maneuverability, its engine strength also carried an inherent risk. In certain conditions, in the hands of even the most skilled pilot, the aircraft could become its own enemy, spinning out of control and exposing its pilot to danger. Reports would later describe this phenomenon in technical terms. The radial engine, while powerful, shifted the aircraft's center of gravity, making extreme maneuvers hazardous. The wide wings that allowed for aggressive turns also created aerodynamic quirks that could lead to a loss of control if mismanaged. In the chaos of battle, where split-second decisions determined life or death, these quirks were fatal. But witnessing it firsthand in the sky, watching an Fw-190 spin like a toy in the wind, the Soviet pilots realized something even more profound. They understood the duality of the machine, the idea that greatness often carries hidden weaknesses, and that mastery over the sky was as much about understanding the enemy's flaws as it was about skill and courage. In the coming days, these pilots would carry the memory of that sight into combat, teaching others, adjusting tactics, and finding ways to exploit the vulnerability they had seen. It became a lesson in humility, precision, and the constant tension between respect and fear in the skies of war. The story of the Phobie 190's spin would ripple through Soviet air strategy, shaping encounters that were as much psychological as they were physical. And so, the legend of the Phobie 190 continued not just as a deadly opponent, but as a study in contradiction. Its speed was unmatched, yet that same speed could betray it. Its power was awe-inspiring, yet fragile under certain conditions. And for the Soviet pilots who watched it that day, the lesson was clear. Every weapon has a weakness, and every strength carries a hidden cost. In the theater of war, understanding that balance could mean the difference between survival and death. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the clouds in hues of orange and crimson, the pilots turned back toward their base. The wind carried the distant echoes of engines, a reminder that the sky was never truly empty, and somewhere above the frozen plains, the Phobie 190 had disappeared into the clouds, leaving behind a story that would be told for years. A story of power, danger, and the moment when the ultimate weapon revealed the flaw that could cost even the bravest pilot his life. The Phobie 190's reputation had spread like wildfire across the Eastern Front, whispered in mess halls, shouted over radio channels, and scribbled in pilot logs. It was fast, brutal, and relentless. But that day when Soviet pilots watched it spin out, something had shifted. They had glimpsed a crack in its armor, a fleeting vulnerability that no manual or briefing could fully capture, and now they were determined to learn how to turn that weakness to their advantage. Combat over the Eastern Front was chaotic and unforgiving. Snow-covered fields, frozen rivers, and endless forests blurred into a patchwork below. Pilots had to fight not only the enemy, but the elements themselves. The wind would whip through their cockpits, ice would form on wings, and visibility could drop to near zero in seconds. In this unforgiving landscape, the Phobie 190's speed and agility had previously been almost untouchable. Soviet fighters often struggled to keep pace, to match its turns, to get within firing range before it disappeared into the horizon. But now, armed with the knowledge of its hidden flaw, a new kind of strategy began to take shape. Soviet instructors emphasized patience and precision. Pilots were trained to bait the Phobie 190 into aggressive maneuvers, to push it towards spins and stalls, and to exploit its quirks rather than trying to match it in raw speed. The very qualities that made it a terror in the skies, its powerful engine, its wide radial fuselage, its tight turn capability, could be manipulated. If a German pilot pushed too hard, too fast, or too sharply, the aircraft could lose its delicate balance. One wrong angle in a dive, one overcorrection in a turn, and the Phobie 190 would betray its pilot. Veteran pilots recounted countless encounters where this knowledge saved lives. They described chasing a German fighter through the clouds, hearts pounding, eyes glued to the enemy's movements. The Phobie 190 would twist, bank, and dive with astonishing grace, and the Soviet pilot would hold steady, waiting for the critical moment. And then it would come the tiniest hesitation, the faint wobble in the roll, the subtle drift that signaled the spin was beginning. At that instant, the hunter became the hunted. Interestingly, the W190's spin wasn't immediate doom. It could be recovered, but only by a pilot with both skill and calm nerves. Many German pilots did not have the luxury of calm in the heat of battle. Fear and adrenaline, combined with a momentary misjudgment, could send the aircraft into an unrecoverable descent. Soviet pilots observed this again and again, noting patterns: over-tight turns at low altitude, excessive dives following high-speed maneuvers, and certain angles of attack where the aircraft's engine torque destabilized it. These were small details, almost imperceptible, but once recognized, they were a pilot's lifeline. In addition to tactics, the Soviets relied on intelligence and engineering studies. Captured Phobie 190 wrecks became invaluable sources of knowledge. Mechanics and aeronautical engineers examined every bent panel, every scorched engine block, every broken control surface. They discovered that the aircraft's radial engine, while granting explosive acceleration, also shifted weight in a way that made extreme maneuvers risky. Its wide wings, perfect for tight turns and sudden rolls, created unpredictable turbulence under certain conditions. In essence, the very design that gave it supremacy could be exploited if one knew exactly how to press the limits. Soviet pilots began to integrate these lessons into group tactics. Squadrons learned to work together, coordinating attacks to force the FW-190 into high-stress situations. One pilot might feint a retreat, baiting the German into a dive. Another would shadow from a different angle, ready to take advantage if the aircraft began to wobble. These strategies were risky, relying on timing, nerves, and a keen understanding of both their own machines and the enemy's. But the payoff was immense. Once the FW-190 was trapped in its own momentum, it became vulnerable, and the tide of an engagement could shift dramatically in favor of the Soviets. There were also stories of improvisation under fire. Pilots recounted moments when instinct and desperation combined into brilliance. One tale described a Soviet pilot, low on ammunition, luring an FW-190 into a series of dives and rolls, mimicking a mistake that would trigger the spin. The German pilot, confident and aggressive, overcorrected, and the aircraft went into a violent, uncontrollable spin. The Soviet pilot narrowly avoided collision, but the enemy fighter crashed into a frozen river below. These encounters were as much mental battles as physical ones. The dance of wits, the test of nerves, the understanding that one small misstep could change everything. The FW-190 also taught a larger lesson about war in the skies. Technology and engineering could create incredible machines, but human skill, observation, and patience often mattered just as much. The Soviets realized that no aircraft, no matter how fearsome, was invincible. Every weapon had a breaking point, and every pilot had a role in finding it. These realizations shaped training programs, altered dogfight tactics, and even influenced aircraft design. Pilots were encouraged to think like their enemy, to anticipate mistakes, and to use the strengths of their own machines in ways that amplified the FW-190's vulnerabilities. By the end of 1943, Soviet aviators had gained a new confidence. They had faced the terror of the FW-190, not just with courage, but with insight. Each encounter reinforced the same lesson: respect the enemy, understand the machine, and always look for the hidden weaknesses. Stories circulated, shared in hushed tones in mess halls and loud laughter in debriefings. The spin, they called it, a term that carried both fear and fascination. It became a symbol of hope, proof that even the mightiest adversary could be undone by careful observation and daring execution. And yet, for all their success, the sky remained unforgiving. Each sortie brought danger, uncertainty, and the constant reminder that even a single mistake could be fatal. The FW-190's shadow lingered in every cloud, every horizon, a predator that demanded respect. But now, Soviet pilots flew with a quiet knowledge. If they remained disciplined, patient, and vigilant, they could confront that predator on equal footing. The very aircraft that had once inspired dread now offered an opening, a chance to turn the odds in their favor, and a lesson that would echo through every dogfight over the frozen plains of the East. The winter sky had a strange quiet to it, as though the clouds themselves held their breath. The Soviet pilots knew the W-190 could appear at any moment, a flash of grey metal against the icy expanse. Today, the tension was almost tangible. Each engine hum, each distant echo of wind across the frozen fields, seemed amplified. They had faced these machines countless times, studied their quirks, and trained relentlessly, but there was no rehearsal for the real thing. Combat was chaotic, unforgiving, and utterly unpredictable. Suddenly, a shadow tore across the horizon. The unmistakable silhouette of the FW-190 sliced through the clouds, diving with lethal intent. The pilots tensed, gripping their controls, hearts pounding. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for, the test of everything they had learned. The German fighter rolled aggressively, banking into a maneuver meant to intimidate and dominate. But the Soviet pilots held their nerve, positioning themselves carefully, anticipating the telltale signs of instability they had studied so closely. The FW-190 accelerated, twisting into a tight barrel roll. Its engine roared, echoing across the plains, and for a brief heartbeat, it seemed untouchable. And then, almost imperceptibly, the shift happened. The plane's trajectory wavered, a subtle wobble in the roll. One of the Soviet pilots recognized it instantly. The spin had begun. Time slowed. Every second felt like an eternity. The Fu-190 twisted and pitched, the metal bird caught in its own momentum, and the pilot's control faltered. What followed was a delicate dance of skill and courage. The Soviet pilots maneuvered carefully, circling, observing, waiting for the moment to strike without provoking further instability that could endanger themselves. The Fu-190 continued to spin, a terrifying display of power turned against itself. Smoke curled from the engine, and the wind screamed through the cockpit openings. The Predator had become prey. Its immense strength now a liability. Somehow, through sheer will and experience, the German pilot regained partial control. The aircraft leveled for a moment, its deadly shape cutting across the horizon once more. But the strain of the maneuver had left its mark. The radial engines stuttered, the control surfaces ached under the pressure, and the pilot's focus had begun to waver. One more aggressive turn, one more dive too sharp, and the aircraft would meet the fate so many others had faced before it. The Soviet pilots pressed their advantage carefully. They didn't need to destroy the W-190 immediately. They simply needed to exploit the weakness, force errors, and guide the machine into situations where its own power became its undoing. With patience, precision, and nerves of steel, they executed the plan. The enemy fighter overcommitted in a desperate attempt to regain dominance. The spin returned, violent and uncontrollable this time, and the FW-190 tumbled toward the frozen earth below. Watching it fall, the Soviet pilots felt a complex mix of relief, awe, and lingering fear. They had seen the impossible, observed the pinnacle of German engineering undone by the very qualities that made it extraordinary. The lesson was profound. In the sky, every advantage carries a hidden risk, every strength a potential weakness. Courage alone was not enough. Understanding, discipline, and observation were just as vital. These moments shaped the next generation of Soviet air strategy. Pilots who had faced the Fu-190 shared their experiences tirelessly. Debriefings became detailed analyses of maneuvers, engine quirks, and aerodynamic anomalies. Schools and training programs emphasized anticipation and patience, teaching new aviators to read the subtle cues in enemy aircraft behavior. The Fu-190 became both a nightmare and a teacher, a machine that demanded respect, but also revealed the rewards of careful study. As winter gave way to spring, stories of these encounters spread. Pilots recounted the spins, the narrow escapes, and the dramatic recoveries. The legend of the FW-190's duality, the weapon of immense power with hidden fragility, was cemented in the collective memory of those who flew the skies over the Eastern Front. For every pilot lost, there was knowledge gained, a lesson etched in the frozen clouds and the roar of engines. Looking back, the tale of the W-190 is more than a story of combat. It is a story of human courage and ingenuity, of understanding the delicate balance between man and machine. It is a reminder that in war, as in life, appearances can be deceiving. The deadliest weapon may carry within it the seed of its own undoing, and those who survive are often those who see beyond the obvious, who remain calm under pressure, and who learn to anticipate the unexpected. By the end of the war, Soviet pilots approached every encounter with the same combination of respect and calculation. They had faced the FW-190 and lived to tell the tale, having discovered that the very qualities that inspired terror could also be exploited with patience, knowledge, and courage. And in that revelation, they found a quiet confidence, a knowledge that even in the face of overwhelming power, understanding and skill could tip the scales. High above the snow-covered plains, where the echoes of engines faded into the horizon, the story of the W-190's spin remained. It was a symbol, a lesson, and a warning. Every weapon has its flaw, every strength its hidden risk, and in the delicate balance of sky and steel, wisdom is the ultimate weapon. The Soviet pilots who had witnessed it understood this better than anyone, carrying that lesson with them into every dogfight, every sortie, and every corner of the war-torn sky. And so, the Fu-190, both predator and teacher, faded into history not merely as a machine of war, but as a testament to the eternal dance between skill, courage, and the unforeseen weaknesses that lie hidden within even the greatest of machines.